Hi.
Alright, so I guess I'll start by saying that moving to New York was way out of my comfort zone. I'm Peter, 27, fresh off a job offer from Google, and thought I was ready to take on the city. My parents passed a few years back, which left me on my own with no real roots to return to. So, a new job at Google felt like a chance to start something for myself. When I got here, I didn't realize how cutthroat the apartment scene would be. The prices were insane, and I was just about ready to throw in the towel and look somewhere outside the city when I found this ad online. An apartment in Bushwick. It wasn't ideal, but I was desperate. Turns out, the roommates were Mickey and Beth. Mickey's a drag performer who goes by Starry Night on the weekends, and he's got more makeup than a Sephora. Beth's a bit of an enigma, sharp but with a sarcastic side that always catches me off guard. These two were something else, totally different from the crowd I was used to back in Nashville. The apartment itself was quirky. Mickey's costumes were everywhere, and Beth had this endless pile of half-read books and vinyl records. Not my scene, but I was grateful to have a roof over my head. The job at Google was demanding, and the adjustment wasn't easy. Long hours, high expectations, and little time for much else. Some nights, I'd come home exhausted, wondering if I'd made the right choice. The first few weeks felt like a fever dream. Between the non-stop hustle at work and the chaotic rhythm of our apartment, I barely had time to catch my breath. Mickey would get home late, often in full drag, throwing glitter everywhere and telling me stories about his wild performances. He'd dramatically reenact his entire show right there in the living room, as if I was the audience he missed out on. Beth, on the other hand, was more the keep-to-herself type, though she had her moments. She'd pull out her vintage record player and put on something slow moody. Then she'd sit cross-legged on the couch, a glass of red wine in one hand, a cigarette in the other. She'd raise an eyebrow when she caught me watching and say, "Peter, the city will swallow you whole if you let it." She was full of cryptic advice like that. And somehow, it stuck with me. Living with them wasn't easy. There were the usual roommate spats over dishes and noise. But more than that, I just didn't feel like I belonged. Google was intense, and I'd go to work early, come home late, and rarely saw anyone outside the walls of that apartment. Even though Beth and Mickey tried to include me in their conversations or their weird little adventures around the city, I always felt like a spectator in my own life. I'd often sit in my room, scrolling through social media and seeing old friends back in Nashville with their steady, predictable lives. I'd wonder if I should have just stayed. But when you've got no family to lean on, no familiar faces to keep you grounded, you kind of just keep moving forward, even when you're unsure. One night, while I was lying in bed, Mickey knocked on my door. "Peter," he said in that loud, over-the-top voice he used for everything, "you can't just work all the time. It's depressing." He threw himself onto my bed like he'd known me his whole life. "Alright, so what do you suggest?" I asked, trying not to laugh. Mickey's eyes lit up. "Dating. A guy like you should be out there, meeting people. Or do you want to end up an old man in a cubicle?" He was relentless. "Beth, get in here," he yelled, summoning her like she was part of his grand scheme. She walked in, gave me a look, and crossed her arms, clearly intrigued by whatever Mickey was about to propose. "Beth, tell Peter he needs to get a life. Or more specifically, a love life." Mickey said this like he was bestowing some great wisdom. Beth smirked and shrugged. It couldn't hurt. "You're in New York. Might as well have some fun." That's how I ended up on a dating website. Beth and Mickey sat with me, flipping through profiles, giving their unfiltered commentary. I laughed harder that night than I had in months. They felt like the first friends I'd had in a long time. And that's when I stumbled upon her profile, Susan. She was striking, with sharp blue eyes and a smile that looked both confident and warm. Investment banker, world traveler, living in Manhattan. Way out of my league, but I figured why not? So, I shot her a message. And to my surprise, she responded. I spent way too much time staring at her message, second-guessing every possible response. Eventually, with Beth and Mickey breathing down my neck, I sent something back, casual but with a little humor. She replied almost immediately, and we started chatting. Our first date was at some upscale cocktail bar in Manhattan. I got there early, trying not to look like a lost tourist among all these polished city types. When she walked in, I almost forgot to breathe. Susan was even more striking in person, dressed in a way that was somehow both professional and effortless. Confident. Like she'd walked straight out of a Wall Street boardroom and into this dimly lit bar, where she barely even needed to check her phone. She just fit. She spotted me and flashed this easy, knowing smile, the kind that says, "You're not getting away from me now." And from that moment, I was hooked. She had this way of looking right at me, no glancing at her watch or around the room. Just this full focus that made me feel like I was the only person in the city. "So, Peter from Tennessee, how's New York treating you?" she asked, leaning forward like she was genuinely interested. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Well, I don't exactly fit the Wall Street mold," I said, gesturing around. "But the city's growing on me." She laughed, and we just fell into this rhythm. Talking to her was easy, even though I felt like an outsider in her world. She told me stories about her job, these insane hours and high-stakes deals that would make anyone else's head spin. I shared bits of my own life at Google, my crazy roommates, even the small-town stories from back in Nashville. And she listened, really listened, like each story mattered. By the time we finished our drinks, it felt like we'd known each other for years. She walked with me down to the subway, and as we were saying goodbye, she gave me this soft, almost shy smile, completely different from her usual confidence. "I had a great time tonight," she said. "Me too," I managed, my heart racing. I wanted to say more, to keep the night going somehow, but I just watched her walk away, disappearing into the crowd. When I got home, Beth and Mickey were waiting up for me, grinning like a couple of proud parents. "Well," Mickey demanded, bouncing on the couch, "tell us everything." I gave them the rundown, leaving out the parts that felt too personal to share just yet. Mickey swooned dramatically when I mentioned how Susan looked, and Beth nodded approvingly, like she'd always known this would be good for me. And she was right. Susan and I started seeing each other every weekend, and things moved fast. We'd go on these spontaneous dates, wandering the city late at night, finding hole-in-the-wall restaurants, or just talking over coffee until sunrise. Being with her made me feel like I'd finally found my place in New York, like all the pieces were starting to fit together. About 2 months in, she invited me to a friend's party. It was one of those sleek rooftop gatherings with views of the skyline, a total departure from anything I'd ever experienced. But with her by my side, it didn't feel so foreign. We'd spent half the night just taking in the view, the city lights stretching endlessly below us. I had one arm around her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged right there, right in that moment. It wasn't long after that night that we both knew this wasn't just some fling. We didn't do the big, elaborate proposal thing, just a quiet decision, late one night over takeout in her apartment, that we wanted to make it official. A few weeks later, we went down to City Hall. Simple. Fast. Just the two of us, in the middle of a workday, sneaking off from our jobs like a couple of teenagers. I walked out of City Hall with Susan on my arm, feeling like I was living a whole new life. I couldn't wait to tell Mickey and Beth that, somehow, I'd gone from lonely new guy in the city to a married man with this incredible, successful woman by my side. And for a while, it was everything I'd hoped for. After the City Hall ceremony, life felt like it had shifted into a kind of surreal golden haze. I'd never thought I'd end up married so fast, let alone to someone like Susan. She was magnetic. Her energy, her ambition, it pulled me in like nothing I'd ever felt before. She wasn't the kind to settle down and play house, but that was part of what I loved. Our honeymoon phase was more like a whirlwind. Susan had a knack for turning even the simplest things into an adventure. We'd take off for weekend trips upstate or spend nights roaming around the city, finding rooftop bars, jazz clubs, art shows. The kind of lifestyle I'd only ever seen in movies. I'd surprise her sometimes with little notes in her bag, or I'd make breakfast and leave it out before I ran off to work. And every time she saw these gestures, she'd flash this dazzling smile that made everything worth it. Mickey and Beth couldn't get enough of the stories. They'd ask about our latest escapades, sometimes making bets on where we'd gone or what we'd done. Mickey especially loved the romance of it all, and Beth, well, she'd just nod, that sly smile of hers saying she predicted this all along. For a while, everything felt perfect. Work was still tough, but having Susan to come home to somehow made the stress manageable. She'd vent about her own job too, about the long hours and demanding clients. We'd unwind together, our evenings becoming this comfortable routine of wine, shared complaints, and laughter. But then, maybe 6 months in, there were these subtle changes. She'd come home late, often brushing it off with a quick excuse about client meetings or last-minute deadlines. Sometimes, when we were out together, she'd be glued to her phone, texting someone with an intensity that made me feel like I wasn't even there. It's like we went from being in sync to feeling off. One night, I planned this big romantic dinner for us. Candlelight, her favorite wine, the works. But she showed up over an hour late. When she finally walked in, she looked surprised, almost annoyed. "Oh, Peter," she said, tossing her bag aside. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." I laughed it off, trying to make light of it. Just wanted to do something nice for my wife. She barely smiled, her focus already drifting as she checked her phone. "It's sweet. I'm just exhausted." She picked at her food, giving these distracted responses as if her mind was somewhere else. I tried to pull her back, to get her talking like we used to, but it felt like trying to grab hold of smoke. Things kept shifting after that. She'd cancel plans last minute, saying she was swamped at work. I wanted to believe her. I mean, she was always ambitious, always busy. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, like she was drifting somewhere I couldn't reach. One weekend, I suggested we go upstate, just the two of us, like old times. She paused, avoiding my gaze. "Actually, I've got this client dinner on Saturday. Rain check." "Sure," I said, smiling, but it didn't feel right. Susan used to jump at the chance to get away with me. Now, it felt like every little thing I did was a bother. Then one night, after a late work event, I got home, and she was on her laptop in bed. She didn't notice me right away, so I just stood there watching. She had this serious look, her brow furrowed, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I saw her minimize a window and glance over her shoulder before she shut the laptop, her face softening when she finally saw me. "Hey," she said, smiling brightly, as if everything was fine. "How was your day?" But that hidden screen, that split-second look of guilt, it lingered. Something wasn't adding up. And once that seed of doubt was planted, I couldn't ignore it. A few days later, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced over, just out of habit, and saw a notification from a dating app. It took everything in me not to grab the phone and go through it. But I didn't want to believe it was what it looked like. When she came out, smiling as if everything was normal, I felt this hollow ache I couldn't explain. It was like the whole foundation of my life had started to crack, and I had no idea what I was standing on anymore. And for the first time, I wondered if I really knew the person I'd married at all. That moment with the dating app notification kept replaying in my mind. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a mistake, or maybe something left over from before we met. But the unease stayed with me, gnawing away in the quiet hours when she was out late or glued to her phone. I started noticing things, small things, like how she'd get irritable whenever I asked about her schedule or how she'd answer her phone in hushed tones, ducking into the other room. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to bring it up in the least accusatory way possible. "Susan, are we good?" She looked up from her phone, surprised. "Of course we are, Peter. Why wouldn't we be?" "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've been distant. It feels like something's off between us." She sighed, sounding exasperated. "Peter, I'm just busy. My job is intense right now. It has nothing to do with us." I nodded, not wanting to push it. But she didn't offer any more reassurance. She just went back to her phone, the conversation hanging in the air like smoke that never really clears. Over the next couple of weeks, it got worse. Nights would go by where she'd barely say 2 words to me, then suddenly she'd be overly affectionate, almost like she was compensating. But those moments felt forced, like she was putting on a performance. I'd reach out to hold her hand, and she'd pull away, making some excuse about being tired or needing to finish work. One weekend, Beth noticed me staring off during breakfast. "All right, spill it," she said, setting her coffee down. "Something's up. You look like you're a million miles away." I hesitated, not sure if I should say anything. But eventually, the words just came out. "I think Susan's hiding something from me." Beth exchanged a quick look with Mickey, who was suddenly very interested, his spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. "Like what?" she asked gently. I swallowed hard, not wanting to believe my own suspicions. "I saw a dating app notification on her phone the other day. And she's been different. Distant. Canceling plans, always on her phone, acting irritated when I ask about her day." Mickey leaned forward, his face serious for once. "Peter, maybe it's time to be honest with yourself. If you're seeing red flags, don't ignore them. Confront her, or at least find out the truth before you let this eat away at you." Beth nodded, her face sympathetic. Just, be careful, all right? This kind of thing. It can mess you up if you're not ready for what you might find. Their words stuck with me. It was good advice, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her directly again, not without knowing more. And that's when the idea of a private investigator crept into my mind. I hated that I was even considering it, but every time I thought about just asking her outright, I could picture her brushing me off or spinning another excuse. I needed to know for sure. So I did it. I hired someone, explaining the situation over the phone, feeling this strange mix of guilt and desperation. He agreed to start immediately, said he'd follow her movements, check her phone records, the whole 9 yards. I barely slept that week, jumping every time my phone buzzed, waiting for news that I didn't even want to hear. Then, a week later, I got the call. The investigator's voice was calm, professional, like he'd done this 100 times before. "Peter," he said, "I have something to report. She's been meeting someone regularly. They met on that dating app you mentioned and have been seeing each other for the past month." I just sat there, numb, as he went over the details. They'd meet up at lunch, in hotel lobbies, sometimes in the evenings. My mind felt like it was splitting in two, part of me registering every word, part of me shutting down, like I couldn't bear to let the reality sink in. When I hung up, I felt like I was floating outside my own body. All I could see was Susan's face, that warm, bright smile that used to make me feel whole. And now I was left with the wreckage, feeling like a fool who'd been left out of his own life. I didn't know how I'd do it yet, but I knew one thing: I had to confront her. And this time, there would be no going back. The night I decided to confront her, I waited up, sitting alone in the dim light of our living room. Susan walked in, looking surprised to see me awake. She was dressed to the nines, way too overdressed for a work dinner, as she'd called it. "Peter, you're up late," she said, trying to sound casual. But I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. I didn't waste time. "Susan, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She sighed, rolling her eyes slightly. "Peter, I've told you, I'm just busy. This paranoia of yours is really getting out of hand." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I know about the other guy, Susan. I know everything." For a second, she froze. Then her expression shifted, like a mask dropping. Her face hardened, and that was the moment I knew there was no coming back from this. "You were never supposed to find out," she said quietly, almost like she was annoyed rather than ashamed. "I didn't want to hurt you, Peter, but things just happened." I stared at her, unable to believe how cold she sounded. "Susan, we're married. How could you do this?" She shrugged, looking away. "I don't know, Peter. Maybe we moved too fast. Maybe. I needed something more." In that moment, something in me broke. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we were building, it all felt like a cruel joke. I didn't say anything else. I just got up, went to the bedroom, and started packing a bag. She didn't stop me. That night, I packed just enough to get me through a few days. The silence between us was thick, only broken by the sound of the zipper as I closed my suitcase. Susan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. It was like I was looking at a stranger. "Where are you going to go?" she finally asked, her voice cold, almost indifferent. I didn't look at her. "Somewhere that isn't here. Don't worry, I'll be in touch with a lawyer about the rest." She flinched at the word lawyer, but didn't respond. Instead, she just watched as I walked past her, suitcase in hand, out into the hallway. I left without another word, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing in a way that felt painfully final. When I got to the street, I took a deep breath of the cool night air. It felt surreal, like I'd woken up from a dream, only to find out my life was a nightmare. I called Beth, my voice low and unsteady as I explained what happened. She didn't ask questions. She just told me to come over. Beth and Mickey were waiting up when I arrived, and they didn't need me to say anything to know what had gone down. Mickey wrapped me in a hug without a word, and Beth put her hand on my shoulder, her face filled with concern. "You did the right thing," she said softly, guiding me to the couch. I sat there in a daze, trying to process everything. Beth made tea, Mickey brought over a blanket, and they just sat with me, their quiet presence filling the room. It was strange, sitting there with these two, people who were barely in my life a year ago, yet in that moment, felt like the only family I had. As the night went on, I felt the weight of the situation start to sink in. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was furious. She'd shattered everything we'd built, and for what? As I lay awake in the silence of their living room, anger and betrayal simmered beneath the surface. I knew then that this wasn't over. Not yet. The morning after, I woke up on Beth and Mickey's couch, feeling more like a ghost than a person. My mind was buzzing with everything I'd learned, replaying every moment, every sign I'd ignored, every excuse she'd fed me. Beth handed me a mug of coffee as I sat up, her eyes full of empathy. "Peter," she started carefully, "what are you going to do?" I stared into the coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. "I'm filing for divorce. That's the first thing." Mickey, who had been unusually quiet, leaned forward. "That's the smart move," he said, nodding. "But, is that all you want to do?" I looked at him, surprised by the question. He didn't elaborate, just gave me this knowing look that told me he understood the level of betrayal I was dealing with. I hadn't thought about revenge, not really. But something in me shifted as he spoke. I didn't want to just walk away with a divorce decree. I wanted her to feel what I was feeling. She'd humiliated me, lied to me, shattered my life in a matter of months. It wasn't enough to just leave her. I wanted her to realize what she'd thrown away. Over the next few days, I started to plan. Every night, I'd sit with Beth and Mickey, laying out ideas, fine-tuning each detail. I wasn't looking to ruin her life, just to give her a taste of what she'd done to mine. I reached out to our mutual friends, ones I knew would listen, ones who didn't know what had happened yet. Carefully, I explained the situation, the truth about her affair, and how she'd been using that dating app while married. Word spread fast. I made sure they knew exactly what kind of person Susan really was, planting the seeds in conversations here and there, letting the truth do its work. Then, I contacted her workplace. Her position as an investment banker relied heavily on her reputation. Clients, bosses, and partners had to trust her. A carefully worded email found its way to her manager, anonymously explaining her behavior outside of work. Her professional world was built on image, on control, and I knew that if I could shake that, even just a bit, it would unravel her perfectly curated life. Finally, I made an appointment with our lawyer to go over the financials. Since she'd technically committed infidelity, I had leverage in the divorce. I'd be able to keep what was mine, and I made sure she'd lose out on anything we'd saved or planned together. I wasn't just going to leave her, I was going to leave her with nothing but the mess she'd made. After a week of preparation, I was ready. I knew that when she realized what I'd done, she'd try to fight back, but by then, it'd be too late. The truth would be out, and her world would be as shattered as mine had been. Beth and Mickey were there every step of the way, like the family I never expected to find in New York. By the time I filed the divorce papers, I felt lighter, almost free. Susan's betrayal had blindsided me, but taking control, making her face the fallout of her own choices, it felt like reclaiming my life. And as I walked out of the lawyer's office, I knew I was done with her, done with the anger and pain she'd caused. From that moment, I was ready to move forward. A few days after I filed, the fallout began. Susan must have received the divorce papers that morning, because by lunchtime, she was blowing up my phone with calls and texts. I didn't respond to any of them. I wanted her to stew in the silence, to realize that I was beyond listening to her excuses. Around dinner time, though, she showed up at Beth and Mickey's place, pounding on the door, her face twisted in frustration. I hadn't seen her look that unhinged before. It was like seeing her without her usual calm, controlled mask, and a small part of me enjoyed it. When I opened the door, she immediately launched into it. "Peter, what is all this? Divorce papers? Telling everyone about my affair? Are you trying to destroy my life?" I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Destroy your life? Susan, you're the one who stepped out, who lied, who kept meeting him behind my back. I'm just letting people know who you really are." Her expression shifted, from anger to something that almost looked like panic. "I made a mistake, all right? People make mistakes, Peter. I thought we could move past it, but you," she broke off, her voice cracking. "You thought I'd just roll over and forgive you," I replied, my voice steady. "But I deserve better than that. You threw away our marriage like it meant nothing, so why should I give you anything more?" She tried to argue, claiming that it wasn't serious with the other guy, that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But each excuse felt hollow, and I could see in her face that even she didn't believe her own words. Finally, her tone shifted, desperation creeping in. "Peter, I'll lose everything if this goes public. My career, my reputation. Can't we work something out? But I just shook my head. That's not my problem, Susan. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it. The realization finally seemed to hit her. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice grew softer, almost pleading. I never thought you'd do this to me. You did this to yourself, I said quietly, stepping back. Now leave. I've got nothing more to say to you. She stood there a moment longer, staring at me, as if she still couldn't believe it. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure as the door shut behind her. It was over. She was out of my life, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift. I didn't need to look back. I was ready to start over, to finally heal, and to leave her betrayal behind me for good. After Susan left that night, a quiet settled over me. It was a strange calm, a kind of peace I hadn't felt since before everything unraveled. I expected to feel more regret, maybe, or doubt, but there was none of that. It was like finally closing a chapter I'd been forced to read over and over. Mickey found me in the kitchen afterward, pouring myself a glass of water. He gave me a long look, like he was measuring something in my face. So how does it feel? He asked, his voice gentle. I took a sip, letting the question settle. Honestly, I feel done. Like, really done. He nodded approvingly. Good. Because you deserve way more than someone who'd treat you like that. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. Beth joined us, wrapping a supportive arm around my shoulder. You're free, Peter. This is a chance to build something real. It won't all make sense right away, but trust me, you're going to come out of this stronger. They were right. And over the next few days, I started making small changes to my routine, letting those small steps forward become my focus. I moved my stuff out of the apartment Susan and I had shared, putting anything that reminded me of her into boxes I never planned to open again. I took some time off work, needing space to clear my head, to decide who I wanted to be now that everything had changed. On one of those days off, Beth and Mickey insisted on dragging me out for a recovery day. We spent the afternoon wandering through the city, hitting up all the little spots they loved but I'd never tried. The best taco stand in Brooklyn, an indie bookstore hidden down an alley, a rooftop park with views that stretched all the way across Manhattan. It felt like New York was opening up to me in a new way, like I was seeing it through fresh eyes, not as a guy trying to fit into someone else's life, but as someone finally finding his own. By the end of the day, we ended up back at the apartment, the three of us lounging around, laughing at some ridiculous reality show Mickey had put on. It was simple, easy. I hadn't felt this kind of warmth in a long time. And that's when it hit me. Susan might have taken a lot from me, but she couldn't take everything. I still had people who cared about me, people who showed up, who stayed. That night, I sat on the fire escape outside my room, looking out over the lights of the city, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it wasn't even about her. It was about me, about starting over, about figuring out who I wanted to be. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start rebuilding. With each passing day, I found myself settling more into my new reality. The anger and hurt began to feel like something distant, like a scar that was healing over. Beth and Mickey were there, helping me get back on my feet, but now I was finding strength on my own too. I started focusing on things I'd let slip, hobbies and passions I'd buried in the mess of work and marriage. I picked up my old guitar, the one I'd barely touched since moving to New York, and began playing again, even joining a local open mic night that Mickey insisted on attending. Beth came too, her face lighting up as I played, giving me that look that said she was proud to see me moving forward. The crowd was small, but it felt good to be out there again, letting myself enjoy something just for the sake of it. Work was still demanding, but now I approached it differently. Without the constant pressure to impress Susan or live up to her standards, I felt more like myself. I stopped chasing perfection and started working at my own pace, even making friends with a few colleagues. The long hours didn't feel as draining when I wasn't rushing home to an empty apartment or to someone who only half listened. And then, there were the quiet nights back at the apartment. Beth and Mickey became family in a way I hadn't expected. We had our own little rituals. Mickey and I would cook dinner together while Beth played records and filled us in on her latest random adventure. Sometimes we'd just sit around, talking late into the night, laughing until we couldn't breathe. I never thought roommates could feel like this, but they'd become my anchors, my constants. One night, Beth noticed me lost in thought. She nudged me with a gentle smile. "So what's next for you, Peter? You've been picking up the pieces. Now it's time to start looking forward. Her question hit me, but it felt right. I didn't know exactly what was next, but the idea of planning for a future, my future, was something I could get behind. I was no longer just moving through life, I was starting to shape it. That night, I made a list, just for myself. Things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, new things to try. It was the first time in years that I'd looked forward instead of back, and it filled me with a sense of excitement. I realized I didn't need to know where I was going to start moving in a new direction. With the list in hand, I started taking small steps toward the life I'd envisioned. It wasn't about big gestures or dramatic changes, just tiny things that added up to something meaningful. On weekends, I'd explore the city, finding new cafes or museums, wandering through parks I'd only seen from a distance. New York felt different now, like it had opened itself up to me in ways I hadn't noticed before. Beth and Mickey became my unofficial guides. They took me to street markets, underground comedy shows, and even on a wild boat party one night, where we laughed until sunrise on the river. We became inseparable, like a little family that looked out for each other. Whenever I felt low or doubted myself, they were there with a reminder of how far I'd come. The freedom was exhilarating. I enrolled in a few photography classes, an old hobby I'd neglected for years. I started to capture the city through my own lens, each shot showing me something new. I even bought a second-hand camera that I found in a small shop in the East Village, and it quickly became my favorite possession. Then one afternoon at a coffee shop, as I was flipping through the shots on my camera, a woman at the next table leaned over. "That's a beautiful shot of the Brooklyn Bridge," she said, nodding at my camera. Her voice was warm, friendly, and it caught me off guard. "Thanks," I replied, a bit surprised by the compliment. Her name was Emily, a writer who'd just moved to the city. We talked for a while, sharing stories about the city, laughing over our rookie mistakes navigating New York. There was an ease between us, something simple and real that reminded me of why I'd come to New York in the first place. We exchanged numbers, and I walked home that night with a strange feeling in my chest, hope maybe, or just the excitement of something new. I wasn't rushing into anything, but it felt good to connect, to let myself open up again without the weight of my past dragging me down. Back at the apartment, Beth and Mickey teased me when they saw the grin I couldn't hide. "Looks like someone had a good day," Mickey joked, winking. I just shrugged, feeling that old spark of excitement. I didn't know where things would go with Emily, and that was okay. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was right where I was meant to be. And that night, as I looked out over the city from my fire escape, I knew I was finally ready to leave the past behind, to embrace whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, life took on a rhythm that felt entirely mine. I'd meet up with Emily for coffee or spontaneous afternoon walks through neighborhoods I'd never visited before. With her, things felt easy, uncomplicated. We didn't try to impress each other, we just enjoyed the small, genuine moments. We'd find some hidden gem of a bookstore or sit on a park bench, people watching, laughing at our random observations, sharing pieces of our lives without any expectations. It was refreshing, a contrast to the intensity of my old relationship with Susan. At work, I found myself more at ease than I'd been in years. Without the constant pressure to prove myself or fit some impossible mold, I began to enjoy my projects again. My colleagues even started inviting me out for after-work drinks, something I'd always avoided before. I'd been too busy, too focused, or at least that's what I told myself. But now, letting people in felt natural. They didn't know all the details of what I'd been through, but they sensed the shift in me. I wasn't just the quiet new guy from Nashville anymore, I was part of the team. Meanwhile, Beth and Mickey were practically beside themselves, watching me build a new life. They'd become my cheerleaders, always there to keep me grounded, to pull me back into the present if I started drifting into old worries or doubts. Mickey, ever the romantic, was convinced that Emily was going to be my great New York love story. Beth just gave me a knowing smile and reminded me not to rush anything. One evening, I was sitting on the couch with Beth and Mickey, flipping through some of my photos. They'd become almost my personal gallery curators, picking out their favorites from each batch and giving me feedback. Beth pointed to a photo of the skyline I'd taken from the top of a building at sunset. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you're really good at this. Have you thought about doing something with your photography?" I looked at her, surprised. "Like what?" "Maybe a gallery show, or even just sharing your work online. I know you've been doing it for yourself, but I think people would love seeing what you capture." The thought stayed with me. I'd never considered sharing my photography with anyone outside my immediate circle. But as I looked at the shots, images of the city, its hidden corners and quiet places, I realized I'd been documenting my journey too. Each photo was a snapshot of my healing, a record of the parts of the city that had helped me find myself again. With a bit of encouragement from Beth and Mickey, I started an Instagram page for my photos. At first, it felt strange, putting myself out there. But as the days went on, the page slowly gained followers. People commented, connecting with the scenes I'd captured, sharing their own stories of New York and the emotions it stirred in them. It was like discovering a new way to be seen, to be understood without saying a word. Emily noticed, too. One afternoon, she sent me a message. Love the new photos. They capture the city perfectly, like you're showing it through a whole new lens. Her words struck a chord, and we ended up meeting for coffee to talk about it. She told me about her own struggles moving to New York, her own efforts to make a place for herself here. And as we talked, I realized that we both understood something profound about starting over, about facing the unknown. As the weeks turned into months, things with Emily deepened naturally, without any of the pressures I'd once felt. We were building something new, not defined by expectations or a fast-track timeline. It was just two people finding comfort in each other's company, laughing at life's twists, and feeling grateful for second chances. One evening, I invited her over to Beth and Mickey's place for dinner. Mickey, ever the host, outdid himself with a full three-course meal, and Beth set up the apartment with candles and soft jazz playing in the background. It felt cozy, intimate, a small gathering, but it felt like the first real home I'd had in a long time. Emily fit in perfectly. She laughed at Mickey's jokes, listened intently to Beth's stories, and joined me in reminiscing about Nashville. Watching her there, laughing with my friends, felt like a glimpse into a life I never knew I could have. After dinner, we sat on the rooftop, wrapped in blankets and sipping wine, looking out over the city lights. Emily leaned into me, and I wrapped an arm around her, feeling more at peace than I ever had. We didn't need to talk, the silence was enough. I felt that familiar flicker of hope again, a gentle warmth, as if life was nudging me forward, reminding me that there was so much more to come. When I walked her home that night, she took my hand, looked at me with that same warm smile that had first drawn me in. "Thank you, Peter," she said softly, "for being here. For letting me be part of this." In that moment I felt it deeply, that I had moved past the pain, past the betrayal, and had found something real, something worth holding on to. I was no longer bound by the past. I was finally free, finally ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Life found its own groove after that. I settled into a routine that felt right, one that was finally mine. I'd spend mornings at the gym or exploring the city with my camera, capturing the little slices of life that most people overlooked. My Instagram page kept growing, and with every new follower, I felt more connected, like my story, and my healing, meant something to others too. Emily and I continued seeing each other, but without pressure or expectations. She was a steady presence, grounding me in a way that felt refreshing and unforced. We'd go on small adventures around the city, trying new food spots, finding quiet spots in Central Park, or just wandering through neighborhoods we hadn't explored yet. One weekend, we even took a train upstate to a quiet town with open fields and rivers winding through it. There, away from the noise of the city, we talked about dreams and life and the kind of future we each wanted. It felt natural, easy. For the first time, I could see a future without feeling afraid of it. Mickey and Beth noticed the shift in me, too. I was laughing more, talking more, letting myself just be. One evening, Mickey surprised me with tickets to an open mic night at a local club. "You're going to play," he declared with a grin, not even leaving room for debate. "I don't know, man," I hesitated, feeling a pang of nervousness. Beth nudged me, smiling. "Peter, you can do this. You're ready." So that night, I took the stage, guitar in hand, heart racing but steady. I sang a few of my old favorites, pouring every ounce of emotion into the music. As I played, I felt something shift inside me. It was like a final release, letting go of all the bitterness, the hurt, the betrayal. When I looked up, I saw Emily, Beth, and Mickey in the audience, cheering me on, their faces full of pride and encouragement. It was a moment I'd remember, a reminder of the new life I'd built, the people who'd helped me along the way. Afterward, Emily hugged me, her eyes bright. "I've never seen you so alive," she whispered. I could feel the warmth of her words, the sincerity, and it hit me just how much my life had changed. I was no longer the person who'd arrived in New York, broken and struggling. I'd become someone else, someone stronger, someone capable of joy again. As the weeks went by, that feeling of being fully alive, of moving forward, became my new normal. I'd gone through hell, but I'd come out the other side with a clarity I'd never had before. I'd found a community, a purpose, and perhaps most importantly, an understanding of my own worth. In quiet moments, I still thought about Susan, about how things had ended. But it no longer hurt. In a strange way, I felt grateful for the whole experience. It had pushed me to grow, to learn, and to find people who truly valued me. I no longer needed closure from her, I'd given that to myself. One Sunday, as I was sitting with Beth and Mickey, talking about plans for the next weekend, Beth looked over at me, smiling softly. "You're really happy, aren't you?" I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into me. "Yeah, I really am." I could finally say it with complete certainty. I'd come to New York looking for a new beginning, and it had given me that, and so much more. Now, as I looked ahead, I felt ready for whatever life had in store. This was my life, my story, and I was just getting started. A year had passed since everything unraveled, and I stood on the rooftop of our apartment, watching the sun dip below the skyline, the city coming alive in its usual way. The view felt familiar now, like a friend who had been with me through it all. Beth and Mickey were inside, setting up for one of our impromptu dinners with friends, laughing as they prepared the food. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt steady, honest, real. As I stood there, lost in thought, Emily joined me, slipping her hand into mine. We hadn't labeled our relationship, but it didn't feel necessary. Whatever we were, it was good. It was enough. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we watched the city lights flicker on, one by one. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, her voice thoughtful. "Coming here, I mean. After everything." I thought about it, surprised at how easily the answer came. "No," I said, shaking my head. New York was a lot, but it gave me something I didn't know I needed. A new start, a way to find myself again. She nodded, smiling. Funny how sometimes you have to lose everything just to figure out what you really want. Inside, Mickey and Beth called us to come eat, their voices echoing out into the twilight. Emily and I laughed, giving each other one last look before heading back inside, hand in hand. The apartment was filled with the warm chatter of friends, the smell of Beth's cooking, and the kind of laughter that made the walls feel like they were holding secrets of their own. Sitting there at the table, surrounded by people who had become like family, I realized that I'd gained far more than I'd lost. The life I had now was built on a foundation of honesty, friendship, and new beginnings. The scars were still there, but they were part of me, reminders of how far I'd come. As the evening wound down, Beth raised a glass, glancing around the table. "To Peter," she said, grinning, "for finding his way back to himself, and for letting us be a part of it." Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I no longer needed to cling to the past or to the pain. I was here in this moment, surrounded by people who knew me, who saw me for who I was. After the last of our friends left, I lingered in the living room with Beth, Mickey, and Emily. We laughed about the night, recapped everyone's best stories, and sat in that familiar, comfortable silence. I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready for it. My past was behind me, and my life was fully mine. Looking around at the people who'd become my family, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known before. I'd made it through the darkest parts, and now there was only light ahead. The city outside was endless, full of possibilities, and for the first time, I could see that clearly. This was only the beginning.
Bye.